Alright, this is Cultural Landscape, Chapter 2, Key Issue 1, Where is the world's population distributed? This is mostly for the 10 or 12 kids in my AP Human Geography prep course this summer. So if you have those worksheets I've provided, you should get them out and use them along with this. Okay, so we have population concentrations. 2/3 of the world are clustered in 4 regions: East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Europe. And I know those 3 Asias are like, why didn't you just say Europe? But I'll show you why in the next coming slides, where I show you where they're particularly located and why there are some distinctions between them. So there's also an emerging cluster that exists in the Northeast USA, Southeast Canada, as well as the Atlantic coast of Africa. And I'll be clarifying those as well. So first off, East Asia. East Asia is 1/4 of the world's people. It includes eastern China, not all of China, eastern China, islands of Japan, the Korean Peninsula, and Taiwan, the island. It's more than half the people of the Chinese live in rural areas and work as farmers. And in contrast, 3/4 of the Japanese Korean workers live in urban areas and work in industrial or service jobs. If you have my worksheet, you should be coloring the area here that's in red on your worksheet as it requires you to do so. This area right here, sorry I didn't mean to go over to India. This area, Japan, China, and the Korean Peninsula. Alright, moving on. We have South Asia. That's another 1/4 of the world's population. That includes India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the island of Sri Lanka. Most of the population is concentrated on the Indus and Ganges rivers. As we discussed way back in 6th grade, almost all population is located near the water. Vital issues back especially years ago, but especially now as well. Also heavily concentrated on India's 2 coastlines, once along near water. Like the Chinese, most are farmers living in rural areas. Then you get to Europe. So make sure you color these in as we go. Europe has 4 dozen countries. Can you believe that? One of them, Monaco, is only 0.7 square miles and has 33,000 people. It's the 2nd smallest country. The smallest country is Vatican City. You might not have known that Vatican City is a country, but it is. Russia is the world's largest country in land area when its Asian part is also included, because Russia touches into Europe and into Asia. That's why a lot of people don't call it Europe and Asia anymore. Many geographers just prefer to call it Eurasia. After all, it's one giant landmass, why separate it into 2. In any case, 3/4 live in cities and fewer than 10% are farmers. High populations, once again, near major cities, major rivers, and coal fields, as well as historic capital cities such as London and Paris, which are also located near water. Then we have Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is 600 million on a series of islands between the India and the Pacific Oceans. Indonesia has 13,677 islands. It's the world's largest, most populous region. Philippine Islands do have a large concentration, as do the river valleys and deltas in Southeast Asia, known as Indochina. High percentages are farmers in rural areas. Make sure you color these in as well on your map. Then you have the Eastern North America. This is Northeast USA and Southeast Canada. It goes all the way from Boston down to Newport News, Virginia. Basically, Newport News is a little bit north of the Virginia-North Carolina border, and it goes west out to the Great Lakes and to Chicago. About 150 million people live in this region, and like the Europeans, most Americans and Canadians in this area are urban dwellers, and fewer than 5% are farmers. Then we get to West Africa. So along the Atlantic coast, especially the part facing the south, you'll notice on the map. Nigeria is the most populous in Africa. Most West Africans work in agriculture. Alright, I should have filled out your chart there. The next one is the word ecumene. It's the portion of the Earth's surface with permanent human settlements. 7,000 years ago, it was a very small percent, but it's been increasing. Here's what it was 7,000 years ago, around 5,000 BC. It's increasing. Here's what it was in AD 1. You'll notice it's gotten more. And here it is in AD 1500, even more. And here it is in AD 1900, even more. Now, despite it increasing, it's still 3/4 of the world population only lives on 5% of the Earth's surface. Why? Well, because the oceans are still 71% of the Earth's surface. Now, non-ecumen would obviously be the areas where people don't live. So if ecumen is where they live, non-ecumen is where they don't live. Then we have the 4 land regions that were in the Cultural Landscape textbook. There's dry lands. These cover 20% of the Earth's surface. There are deserts, insufficient water, abundance of natural resources such as oil. Then we have the wetlands, high levels of precipitation near the equator. Rain and heat depletes the nutrients from the soil and hinders farming. Then you have the cold lands. You have the North and the South Poles, perpetually covered in ice, permafrost, permanently frozen ground, unsuitable for crops, few animals, and few humans live here. Then you have the highlands, steep, snow-covered, sparsely populated. Some high-altitude plateaus and mountains near the equator are densely populated, where farming is possible. Need that farming, need that food. All right. So here it is. If you need to draw a picture of it, I believe in the packet it asks you to do so. All right. Moving on. That was key question 1. I'm going to go on to key question 2 now. Here's key issue 2. Why is global population increasing? Components of population growth. We have the crude birth rate, the CBR. It's the number of live births per year per 1,000 people in the population. The crude death rate is the number of deaths per year per 1,000 people. They average it out by 1,000 to give us a smaller, more manageable number to deal with. And then the rate of natural increase. That is the difference between the CBR and the CDR. So the natural increase rate, the NIR. So during the 21st century, the NIR, I missed it here, it should be the NIR, not the NRI, has been 1.2, meaning that the population of the world has grown each year by 1.2%. In 1963, it peaked 2.2, and it's been sharply declining since the 1990s. Most of Earth's history, though, we had an NIR of near zero, and we'll get to that later. We'll get to the demographic stages of where a natural increase goes up and down. About 82 million people are being added to the world population annually right now. Doubling time, this is the number of years it takes to double a population, assuming constant rate of increase. At 1.2, the world population will double in 54 years. Now, 95% of this natural increase is clustered in developing countries: Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, North Africa, and Latin America. Next, we get into what's called the total fertility rate. This is the average number of children born to a woman of childbearing age, 15 to 49. Shows whether a population can replace its deaths with births. You need to make sure your fertility rate is high enough that as people die, they can be replaced. To reach replacement levels, women of childbearing age need a total fertility rate of 2.1. In 2000, more than 60 countries containing 45% of the world's population had fallen below replacement rate. So some countries are below replacement rate, while others are probably exceeding it. So as a whole on the earth, we're fine, but there are some countries that are going to be struggling with maintaining their population without allowing immigration. The global average is 2.5, higher in developing countries and lower in the developed. We'll get to why in a little bit. Higher in developing, lower in developed. The TFR of combined world may fall to around 2.2 by 2050. That would still be high enough for us to maintain replacement levels, globally at least. Now, predicting population growth is difficult, though, because so much of it depends on the decisions made by women of childbearing age. It's one of the reasons why the developed countries tend to have a lower natural rate of increase, because more women choose to work and women have more access to contraception. China fell from 6.1 to 1.75 in 35 years and has recently dropped to 1.5. But that was largely due to China's policies, where they only allowed so many children to be born, and they tried to prevent people from having the population continue to grow. Iran began allowing family planning, and it fell from 6.8 in 1980 into 1.9 in 2013, thus showing the effect of what happens when you allow women to have control of their ability to manage contraception and decide when to and when not to get pregnant. So how does geography of health influence population dynamics? Well, you have the infant mortality rate, baby's death during the first year following its birth. The IMR is given as cases per 1,000 of live births. So the baby has to be born alive. I know it's kind of a depressing thing to say, but it's true. Child mortality rate is deaths between the ages of 1 and 5. So if you make it past 1 and you die, you're no longer considered infant mortality. It's now child mortality. The IMR and the CMR reflect the overall health of a society. If babies can't live past 1 and children can't live past 5, then there's probably some sort of issue within the society. So the IMR for country doesn't tell the whole story, though. So for example, USA's IMR is 6.1, but for African Americans it's 11.5. So could be for different reasons, like 86% of non-Hispanic whites get prenatal care, but only 80% of African Americans do. And that prenatal care makes sure that the women are getting the best health care as possible, and that way their babies are born as healthy as possible. But, on the other hand, 22% of non-Hispanic whites smoke during pregnancy, which is awful for the mother and awful for the baby, versus 7% of African Americans. So exactly what is the cause of the difference between the total U.S. IMR versus different groups such as African Americans? Well, it can also vary by region. So it's highest in the South, lowest in the Northeast. So overall, it can equate to all sorts. It could be race, there's ethnicity, there's social class, education levels, access to health care. These all vary by regions and can correlate with IMR. There's not one blanket obvious answer. So it's the mixture of all these different things can relate to IMR. IMR has a variety of causes. So you have the physical health of the mother. Societies where women bear a large number of children, the women tend to be undernourished, exhausted from overwork, suffering from disease, and poorly educated. There's improper weaning. That's where you switch them from drinking breast milk and switch them to solid foods. Diarrhea and malnutrition are the leading causes of death, particularly in developing countries. And this is usually caused by poor sanitation due to lack of clean water or poor human waste disposal. We take very much for granted that we have clean water coming out of our pipes most of the time, well, depending on which cities you live in. Sorry, Flint, Michigan. But in other countries, they have a severe lack of potable, clean water. Now, Japan has 2.2 per 1,000, which is great, very low. But there are 4 countries that have something over 100. But that's not so bad if you think 5 years ago it was 22 countries. So the world is getting better. Now, Sierra Leone, which is in Africa, northern Africa, is not doing so well. It has 128 per 1,000, which is 1 death for every 8 newborns. Speaking of newborns, there's the newborn death rate. That's the number of children who die in the first month. In the U.S. and other wealthy countries, this is typically from premature births and low birth weight babies. In other words, it's usually not the case if any error is done by the parents. Sometimes premature babies just happen and low birth weights happen, although prenatal care is usually a good way to help mitigate that. In poorer countries, diarrhea and infections cause half of newborn death rates. 99% of newborn death rates and 98% of maternal deaths, that's where the mother dies while giving birth, occur in the poorer, less developed countries. And even worse in areas of conflict and war, because obviously you have less sanitation, less safety, hospitals, etc., etc. So child mortality, you have a staggeringly high in Africa and Asia, particularly in protein-deficient tropical and subtropical zones. For my 6th graders, people think back to like 6th grade with Papua New Guinea, where they lacked sufficient proteins. And in some countries, more than 1 in 5 children die between the 1st and 5th birthday. So life expectancy is the number of years on average someone may expect to remain alive. Women tend to outlive men by anywhere from 3 to 12 years, depending on the region. At the start of the century, average life expectancy for men was 64 and 68 for women. Far exceeded now in wealthier countries. Japan's expected to be 106 by 2030. And this increased life expectancy is both a benefit and also a problem. My grandparents are 92 years old, and when Social Security was passed in the 60s, no one thought they were going to live to be past 65, 67. They've now lived almost 30 years longer than we expected, which is causing Social Security to struggle to afford it, not to mention the cost of trying to maintain their living standards. Imagine this, you expect you're going to retire at 65, and you still got 40 more years to live. Well, if you graduated college at 25, you've already lived for 40, and you had to work for that entire 40 years to make sure you could put food on the table. Now you're supposed to live for 40 more years without working? I don't know how that's going to work. And of course, AIDS has brought some countries below 40 as it ravages and it causes massive healthcare issues. Now, India, as we talked about population control earlier, they did do some advertising and try and reduce population. You'll see on the side, big families call problems all the way, small families happiness all the way. But to make sure they could reduce their population, maintain control, they had some population planning. They were the first country to have a planning program. Rapid population growth continued, though, in northern and eastern states of India. So in the 1970s, they actually would force sterilization of men with 3 or more children. 3.7 million men were sterilized before opposition led to rioting, but in total, 22.5 million people in India were sterilized. In 2004, one of the states in India, the most populous state, exchanged gun licenses for sterilization. 2 people get you a shotgun license, 3 gets you a revolver license. Wealthy landowners sterilized laborers in exchange for gun licenses, and now it encourages sterilization with housing and food. And I know this all may sound harsh, but if you imagine a country with overpopulation and they don't have the system set up to feed, educate, and maintain health of these people, their thoughts are if they reduce the number of people, it'll make it easier to manage. On the other hand, forcing people or encouraging them to get sterilized, you can see that there could be moral issues with that, to say the least. In 2008, 19.5% of women versus 0.3% of men had been sterilized. All right, that's it for question 2, or key issue 2. We'll move on to key issue 3 now. All right, key issue 3, why does population growth vary among regions? So we have what's called demographic transition. All countries have experienced some changes in their NIR, CBR, and CDR, but at different times and at different rates. But why does this matter? I mean, were Thomas Malthus and Thanos right? Well, there'll soon be too many of us. We have to be concerned about the balance of the world. Or that's what Thomas Malthus would say, and obviously that's what Thanos said in the Avengers Endgames. The demographic transition is a process that goes through these stages and shows where we are moving towards increasing growth or decreasing growth. So demographic transition model stage 1. Low growth has a very high birth and death rates. Virtually no long-term natural increase. Because even though a lot of babies are being born, so many of them are dying so early that it doesn't matter. And other people die as well because of disease and other concerns. So there isn't any long-term natural increase. This is how we were through most of human history. Every country today is in at least stage 2, not state 2, stage 2. Sorry about the typo. So basically stage 1 no longer exists. It's just a historical thing. And it changed largely because of the agricultural revolution. Once we switched from hunting and gathering to growing food and domesticating animals, we had enough food to manage a larger population, and we could grow bigger. Demographic transition model number 2. It's high growth, high birth rate, rapidly declining death rate. So we're having a lot of babies being born, and they're actually not dying as quickly as before. People are growing to be older. In the mid-1700s in the U.S., Europe, this occurred due to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution allowed us to have greater inventions and ways of maintaining health. Africa, Asia, and Latin America reached in the 1950s due to the medical revolution, as medical technology got hierarchically diffused from Europe and America and other places down to Africa, Latin America, and Asia so that they could maintain a healthier population. This medical technology is diffused to these developing countries. Demographic transition model stage 3, decreasing growth. Birth rates are rapidly declining. Death rates continue to decline. So this is the first stage where birth rates start to decline. Birth rates were still high before in the previous model. Now they're down, like it was. Let me make sure I'm right. Yep. It's high birth rates still. Now we're down to decreasing birth rates, rapidly decreasing. And birth rates are still going down. The gap between the CBR and the CDR is narrowing. You can see it right here. Very narrow. And then the urban families are smaller than rural. You know, Europe and North America moved here in the first half of the 20th century. You know, you lived on a farm, you needed to have 5 or 6, 7 kids help you work in the farm. You work in a factory and you have a small 2-bedroom apartment, you don't need 5 or 6 kids. Many countries in Asia and Latin America made this transition in the second half of the 20th century. Now we're on to stage 4. This is low growth. Very low birth rate produces virtually no long-term natural increase and possibly a decrease. CBR equals CDR and NIR approaches near zero. This is what we call zero population growth. If you have a total fertility rate of 2.1, this could produce zero population growth. The reason this model occurs is women have entered the labor market and they have access to birth control. So women don't need to have babies as much. The only thing that keeps so there's no growth going, but people are also not dying as much. So we have a large number of older people, or a larger increasing number of older people, and a smaller number of young. You'll notice here on Denmark's, you got this V shape, the people that are 40, and then you come down to the people that are 10 or lower, there are not as many of them. So if this keeps happening, we start having a larger number of older people and a smaller number of young people, that means the smaller number of young people are going to be required to support the larger number of older people. England in stages 1, 2, and 4 on your chart. So stage 1 was changed by the Industrial Revolution, which led to stage 2. Stage 2 was changed by the movement from rural work. I'm sorry, this is the Industrial Revolution. This should say Agricultural Revolution. Stage 1 was changed by the Agricultural Revolution. Stage 2 was changed by the Industrial Revolution. And stage 3 was changed by women entering the workforce and increased access to birth control. So why does population composition matter? So knowing the number of men, women, and their ages is important because populous country in which half the country is young has different problems than a country with a large population of the elderly. Population pyramids are used to display percentages of each age group in a total population, normally 5-year increments by a horizontal bar whose length represents the share. So you'll notice going up here, up the center, this ages going up 0 to 5. You notice on the left, in the blue, it's male. You notice on the right, in the pink and red, it is female. On the bottom, the numbers show you the population in millions based on age. So in Argentina, we can see that the number of people that are age 90 is less than 0.4 million on both sides, but there's still more women than there are men. The shape is largely determined by birth rate. What do these pyramids tell you about poorer countries? Well, if you look at the one here on the poorer countries, you'll notice that the poorer countries have larger births and they have a very narrow number of old people because people don't live that long. The death rates and birth rates are both high, looks like an evergreen tree. Ages 14 to 40 are 40% of the population. If you live past 5, you're going to keep living, but you're not going to live for that long, not as in comparison to other countries. Oldest people in the top tiers are just 10% of the population. So the idea of living past 64 is pretty slim. How about the country of Niger? If you look at the country of Niger, you'll notice that it's very, very slim at the top and very wide at the bottom. All right, how about Guatemala? Guatemala, it's much broader at the bottom, and it still gets narrow at the top, so look at where you have a chance. At what point do people rapidly start declining? Basically, it looks like, if I were saying it, you get past the 50-year mark, and that's where things start to go down. What do these pyramids tell you about wealthier countries? Wealthier countries, you'll notice that they have a smaller number of young people, and then it has a lot in the middle age, and then you get to the top area, and there's more. Lopsided base with large components of population, not at the bottom, but in the middle. Aging population with a low total fertility rate. Now how about looking at these here? So this is USA as a whole, but let's look at different areas like Lawrence, Kansas. This is a weird shape. Has a lot of people between ages 20 and 24. Why is that? Well, Lawrence, Kansas is a college town, so most people that live there are 20 to 24 years old. This is Naples, Florida. Very small number of birth rates, a lot of very old people. That's because a lot of old people retire to live in Naples, Florida. Laredo, Texas, it's a working class community, a lot of births, and a lot of a small number of elderly because the healthcare and the economy is not that good there. So the chances of living longer are reduced based on the region, education levels, and access to good healthcare. Dependency ratio. This is the relationship between the number of people who are too young to work, 0 to 14, or too old to work, 65 and over, should be a parentheses right after the word over, and the aging working population, that's between 15 and 64. The larger dependency ratio, not ration, the larger the burden on working age people. The grain of the population, this is the population getting old. For instance, Europe has 24 old age dependents for every 100 working age people. But that's going to rise to 47 by 2050. America's got the same issue. We have 26 old age dependents for every 100 working age people, and that's expected to rise to 37 by 2050. Why is it less for America than it is for Europe? I don't know. It could be birth rates or it could be immigration, but something we're doing is going to not allow it to get as high. Africa, by contrast, though, was 6 in 2010. Their challenge is a child dependency ratio. Sub-Saharan Africa young dependents outnumber their old by 14 to 1. Sex ratio, this is the number of males per 100 females in a population. Developed countries have more females because females live longer than males. Most Asian countries have more females than males. I'm sorry, they should not say more females. They should say most Asian countries have more males than females, especially in China and India, because since there's less opportunities for women, it is not unheard of for females to be aborted or for infanticide to have been committed to make sure that males are the main children. Afghanistan, stage 2, how, why? Well, the death rate is dropping dramatically despite a high child mortality rate. 1 in 10 don't live past 5. But for those that do, improved public health services, food, and sanitation mean they live longer. Birth rates are still very high because the whole country has a high illiteracy rates and limited education for women, which correlate with high birth rates. Morocco is in stage 3, how and why? Well, increased access to contraception and the expansion of women in the workforce have led to the steady decrease in birth rate over the last 4 decades. Death rates have been affected by continued advances in medicine and public health. For instance, child mortality rates have dropped tenfold since the 1970s and consistently decline annually. Argentina, stage 4, how and why? Industrialization led to people move from rural to urban areas. Due to the limited space within cities and the changing demands of work, smaller family size becomes an indirect result of urbanization. Birth rates decline. Why? The simple answer, gender equality. Argentine women have been protected, at least in theory, by a civil code that outlaws gender discrimination since 1869. Women maintain a relatively high level of employment and educational opportunities in relation to men. And while the Argentine government has historically been against contraception, today condoms and birth control are widely available without cost. And that is it. Key issues 1, 2, and 3 of Chapter 2. Thanks a lot. Bye.